Let's talk about persistent data in Docker. And when I say persistent data, I'm talking about data that we can use over different containers of the same image. By default, every Docker container has its own virtual disk. And once a container exits, all of this data is removed and cannot be used anymore. In order to be able to use this data on additional containers that we're going to create later, we need this data to be persistent. So I'm back on docs.docker.com, and we're going to move on to part 5, persist the database. Now, as we saw in the previous part, whenever we created a new container of our Node.js application, all of the tasks in our to-do list were removed and we had to start over. What we're going to do in this part is make the database that holds the data of the tasks persistent, so it won't be lost once the container exits, and we will be able to use the same data in new containers of the getting started image. We're going to start with a small example that will show us that the file system on different containers is separate and that they do not share files. To do that, we're going to use the Ubuntu image. Notice that it's a different image than the getting started image we created ourselves, and what the Ubuntu image is going to give us is a small bare bones Ubuntu system. So I'm going to copy this command, and in addition to creating a new container from the Ubuntu image, it's also going to create a file in this container. And the Ubuntu image is being downloaded from Docker Hub, and then a container will be created, and then the command will be ran inside this new container. Notice that the purpose of this part of the command is to make sure that our container keeps running and does not exit. And that's why if we take a look at its state, we can see that its state is up, which means that it's currently running. Since the container is running, we can log into it. And to do that, I'm going to right-click on it and attach shell. And what we see here is a terminal to this specific container. Here we're going to show the contents of the file that we created in the container when we created the container itself. And we can see that it contains some random number. If we run ls, we can see the data.txt file, which is the file that contains the random number. Let's now create a new Ubuntu container, and in the new container, let's run the ls command again. So first, let's close the terminal to this container. And now I'm back in the terminal of my computer, and here I'm going to create the new Ubuntu container and run the ls command. And here we do not have the data.txt file, and the reason is that every container has its own file system. Let's remove the Ubuntu container. And now we're going to create a Docker volume in our computer. A Docker volume is what we need to use the same data across different containers. In this case, we're going to call the Docker volume todo-db. And the Docker volume was created. Now the data for our Node.js application is stored as an SQLite database in this path within our container. So basically all we need to do is map our Docker volume to this path in the container. Let's now remove our old getting started container. Let's now create a new container of our getting started image, but this time we're going to use the -v flag to map our Docker volume to the SQLite database path within the container. And our new container was created and ran, and the data in this one is mapped to the Docker volume. Let's open port 3000, and this time we're going to be served by the new persistent container. And let's add a few tasks here. And now I'm going to remove this container and then create a new container and map it to the same Docker volume. And we now have a new container. But if we get back to port 3000 and refresh the page, And we can see that all of our data is here. And that's because we didn't save the data in the file system of the container itself, but in the Docker volume. By the way, you might want to know where the Docker volume itself is being stored. To do that, we can use the docker volume inspect command. And we also have to specify the name of the Docker volume that we want to inspect. And here we can see the mount point, which is the path in which the data itself is saved in the computer.